We can all agree that Revenge of the Fallen went a little bit too far in a lot of places. However, from a visual effects perspective, this film holds a ridiculous amount of achievements, as at the time it had the biggest and most detailed CGI character that ILM had ever made, along with some of the longest renders ever done in history, in addition to having the biggest explosion ever on screen with actors, all whilst also having one of the highest budgets of the decade. And so when I hear this, my question is always, whilst all of this sounds great on paper, what does this actually mean in terms of crafting this film's visual effects? Well, basically, this entire film was just director Michael Bay's attempt to outdo the previous film at all costs. And so whilst you might think he achieved this through the film's massive characters or giant set pieces, it turns out that a lot of this success was actually much more due to the very small steps that the filmmakers took, and how all of these subtly combined together to make this film a ridiculous technical achievement that pushed filmmaking further than perhaps any other movie in the last few years. And so that's why, to explore these bigger achievements, we're going to break down the brilliance of each of these smaller steps and then use all of that to ask the big question, which is that, in pursuit of outdoing himself, did Michael Bay go too far with this film and start to lose track of what made the first one so special, therefore causing this film and its sequels to have all of these strange, kind of unnecessary little issues? So, to explore this some more, literally just fart for no reason as we dive into the visual effects of Revenge of the Fallen. So, before we get into how this film specifically went out of its way just to outdo its predecessor, to lay the groundwork for this, let's begin with how the general production of Revenge of the Fallen compared to Transformers 2007. Well, essentially, this film did everything we discussed in the last video. You know, practical effects, crazy stunts, ridiculous explosions, but this time around, like we said, they were now deliberately focused on expanding the previous film's more overt shortcomings. For example, whereas in Transformers 1, most of the robots' dialogue was done in these wide shots because their faces were just so difficult to animate, this time around they deliberately chose to have these many long close-up shots of the robots talking, because now, thanks to the lessons learned from the first film, they'd finally cracked this mechanical emoting process. And then a second example of this evolution was that, where in Transformers 1, because the robots were so physically demanding to craft, they only actually had a very small roster of just 14 robots in total. But in this film, they deliberately scaled that number all the way up to having 60 different robots, even though it would take about 30 weeks of total work to get each and every one ready. Or one final example of this evolution is that, whereas in Transformers 1, the robots actually had very little screen time because it was just so hard to keep them looking good, in this film, they more than doubled that amount, and now also had them doing much more complicated movements and actions, to the point where the visual effects team actually said that the easiest shots to do in this film were the hardest ones to do in the previous. But now, for clarity, because I didn't want to retread on the same ground as my last video, I kind of just brushed over a lot of those achievements and made it sound like they just did them without any problems. But of course, each of them was a very ambitious goal that all came with their own problems. And so, to set the stage, here's Michael Bay explaining just how challenging this film's visual effects were.
My one freak out came and I called the producer at ILM and I said, Wayne, any director right now would want to blow their effing head off, right? Okay? How is this movie ever going to effing get done? Please, I'm going to write you a check for $300,000 from my account. Hire more effing people. Anything, just anything to get me out of my misery.
And so yeah, beyond these specific advancements, what else did they begin to do to just deliberately flex on the previous film's achievements? Well, this brings us to perhaps the most underrated scene and most underrated character in this entire film, and that is the Reedman scene. Because one of the goals of this film was to show more variation in the types of transformations that you see on screen, and the Decepticon Reedman was absolutely the standout example of this, but it was also an absolute nightmare to get right. But first, if you wanted to keep your online data so safe that it would take an alien robot made of millions of little ball bearings to break in and steal it, then you should probably check out today's sponsor, Surfshark VPN. Because at this point, I'm just getting absolutely sick of the Zark and the rest of his band of literal comic book villains who basically own the internet and are harvesting my data to do God knows what with it. And so that's why I've been using Surfshark VPN to keep me invisible whilst I'm online. Because what it does is kind of scramble your online presence by moving your location to a country of your choice, therefore throwing off all of these meticulous techniques that these people are using to track you through the net. And by moving country like this, you can also get a whole heap of other benefits. For example, in countries like the UK, there's a lot of content that you just can't access on streaming services or other websites these days, but with Surfshark, within seconds, I was able to just hop to another country until I found one that does have what I was looking for. And then on top of this, you can also do the same thing for finding discounts as well. For example, by changing the country you're in with Surfshark, you can find potentially cheaper deals on things like flights, hotels, or even car rentals. So to be both safer and save money online, go to surfshark.com/CGY or use the code CGY at checkout to get 4 extra months of Surfshark VPN. They offer a 30-day money-back guarantee, so there is literally no risk. And with that, now back to the video and back to why Reedman was such a nightmare to do. Because the filmmakers wanted to have a scene where all of these metallic balls would merge to form a robot shape, which is a fantastic idea and made this shot into one of the most unique things in literally any movie ever. I mean, this was 2009, and I don't think I've seen a single thing since then that's topped this visually. But yeah, this has probably never been replicated because it's actually incredibly hard for visual effects artists to control this many objects at once. Because if you wanted to animate these thousands of balls individually by hand, one at a time, it would just take you literally forever to do so. And so to circumvent stuff like this, what visual effects artists typically do is let a computer simulation take over. As by using the simulation's maths and science and stuff, you can move a tremendous amount of information around by just feeding in a few simple commands like go here or flow there, making simulations fantastic for anything from crafting massive oceans to moving thousands of little balls around. But while simulations are great for doing things at a big scale, the issue is that they're just not great for accuracy, because by relying on maths to move everything around, you can't really get any direct fine control over anything, and it's just more like herding sheep where you can generally send them in one direction, but all in all, each one will find its own way to the objective, which meant that their hands were pretty tied, because on one hand, if you wanted to sort of sheepdog these thousands of balls to the exact positions you need to form the exact robot shape you want at exactly the right time you need them to do so, then how ridiculously complicated does this mathematical algorithm have to be? But on the other hand, they also didn't have the years it would require to hand animate all of this. And so that's why, in the end, they actually did this entire scene backwards. Because what the team at Digital Domain realized was that the only position that they absolutely needed these balls to be in was that final shape of Reedman. And therefore, where the individual balls came from to actually get to this position was actually kind of irrelevant. And so this meant that if they started with these balls already in his shape and then just ran the entire simulation backwards so that he was actually getting deconstructed, this meant that when they then reversed that footage, they'd get the exact result they wanted, as now all of the reversed balls would look like they were flowing upwards to perfectly form Reedman's specific structure, which is just such a simple but genius way of bringing such a complex character to life. But what I really like about this effect is that it perfectly sets the stage for just how brilliant this film's visuals were, and just how many little challenges they were going to have to overcome to make each moment possible. Which nicely brings me on to another massive flex that this film had over its predecessor that was also completely underrated, and that was these fully CGI scenes here. Because if the previous film just about managed to get the robots realistically integrated into live action, then this film took it a massive step further and decided to have its robots be realistically integrated into fully CGI environments. Because in doing this, Bay was able to take the world building of this franchise beyond the limits of Earth and begin to make it more about these incredible robots that came from outer space. But to be honest, I'm not about to start praising the story of this film too much, because that would just be impossible. And so let's just focus on the visual effects for for now. Because, yeah, with Avatar coming out around the same time as this film, and basically being completely CGI, maybe Transformers' fully CGI scenes aren't the most unique achievement, but what I did find very impressive was the way that they managed to perfectly translate Michael Bay's style into these fully digital environments. As with Michael Bay coming from both an advertising background and also having this very hands-on approach where he likes to take control of the camera and such, it means that he has this very distinctive style as to how he frames the camera and as to the types of energy he likes to show on screen. Meaning that when it came to creating these specific camera movements digitally, this suddenly became a really difficult thing to do. Because as anyone who's ever tried to animate a CGI camera will tell you, it's just literally one of the hardest things to get looking right. As just translating the little things like the slight imperfections of the camera shaking as it moves around is just so challenging to mimic digitally. And so this was why the team at Industrial Light and Magic were actually very lucky that they could lean on this relatively new piece of technology that they'd recently been working on, where they could give Michael Bay a low resolution version of the scene in addition to kind of a motion captured camera that would basically allow him to film within this fake CGI environment, meaning that Michael Bay could essentially walk around this virtual set in the real world and therefore frame and film everything just like he would in the real world, and therefore ensured that all of these digital scenes felt just like any other in the movie. And so what this basically was a very early version of that volume technology that they used on The Mandalorian with its massive CGI backgrounds that you can literally walk around, which is cool and everything, but what I really like about this is that it shows just how much of a team effort things like this are. Because sure, the visual effects team can make some incredibly wonderful CGI, and Michael Bay is clearly a very talented director who knows how to place a camera well, but without each other, this film is suddenly something much less special. And so by working together, the two of them can create this genuinely fantastic visual result that you only really can see in this franchise. Which does actually bring us to our third flex on the previous film, which was basically every single thing that happens during the forest fight sequence. And more importantly, the fact that Michael Bay wanted this to be an award-winning type of scene. As beyond having these fantastically integrated interactions between the fake CGI robots and the real-world forest, which we'll get to in just a minute, this scene also represents one of the two massive IMAX sequences in this film. And so now IMAX is one of those things that I've never really fully appreciated, but after learning about the ridiculous lengths that they went to do this sequence in IMAX, I suddenly feel quite bad about being too cheap to spend a few extra pounds on seeing this in its maximum quality. And if it ever comes back to the cinema, I'll definitely put in the effort to go see it again, because essentially what IMAX is a way larger screen that's way higher resolution that therefore demands way more work from the visual effects team, because now it's basically 8 times bigger, and so all of their CGI has to be 8 times more detailed to hold up on it. And so not only did this mean that they had to make all of their robots to an incredibly high level of detail in order to look good, but also in his quest to flex, Michael Bay wanted this sequence to have the specific credit of being one of the first films to feature fully CGI characters integrated into fully live action IMAX footage. And it was this demand of fully live action IMAX footage that suddenly meant that all of the typical tricks that visual effects artists use to keep these robots looking good on camera were just completely off the table. As with these robots being fake, it means it's actually really difficult to set up a real-world camera to film them correctly. As, of course, on set you can't see them, and so you're kind of just imagining what the final result will look like. And so because it's so hard to get the framing of the actors and the invisible thing correct, what visual effects artists will do is come in and very subtly reorient and reposition the camera using digital techniques so that all of these fake things are just about framed correctly. But of course, if you're modifying the camera digitally, then it suddenly means you're no longer working on fully live action footage. And so in pursuit of his award, Michael Bay tried to limit this digital repositioning process as much as possible. And you know what? If you do watch this footage with this in mind, you can kind of tell that something's very slightly off about the framing throughout this sequence. Because yeah, in the end, they did still digitally rework the camera in a few places, but it must have just been very minimal, as the robots often still go out of frame, or it's still feels like each shot is just about missing the key point of the action. But you know what, I kind of like this, because oftentimes the fights in Transformers are these very perfect and clean works of art, presumably because they've been run through Michael Bay's advertising brain, which wants to make things look as good as possible. But here, this fight feels so much more gritty and raw and real, because it's just loose, and all of that really works in favour of a fight where the hero of the film dies. But yeah, this limitation basically just made things significantly harder for the already struggling visual effects team. Because on top of all of that, the even bigger problem was that computer hardware just literally wasn't ready to do this 8 times the level of detail thing. As back in 2009, things like the computing power or the 4K monitors that are needed to look at IMAX footage properly just really weren't a thing. And so to look at this footage, the visual effects team would literally have to work on one quadrant of the screen at a time, as there was basically no way of working on this footage in its full resolution. However, despite all of this, the forest fight is still the absolute peak of this film in literally all aspects. Well, aside from perhaps maybe this one shot here, because the ethos and the intention behind this shot may have actually been the beginning of the end for the entire Transformers franchise. But we'll get to that in just a minute. Because first, speaking of the sheer depth of the details in this film, the next massive flex that this film had over its predecessor was the ridiculous level of detail in the environments that these robots find themselves in. And by this, I don't just mean the sheer variety of locations in this film, but more so the ways that these robots interact with these environments. Because whilst the last film basically had these guys just standing on a static concrete surface, this time as these guys stomped around their new environments, the world would often respond to them, kicking up all sorts of CGI dirt and sand. And it's this interaction between the robot, the footage, and the CGI environment that is also just an absolutely underrated addition, as not only does it make them look far more realistic, as now they're dynamically affecting the world they exist within, but also to make sure that all of this CGI lines up to the camera's movement. A visual effects technique called tracking needs to be meticulously applied. And so tracking isn't something that I've talked about too much on this channel, because typically it's not a super cool thing like making a transformer blow something up, but it is something that's both absolutely essential to getting them to work on screen and, more importantly, allowing them to interact with their environment. Because when you film something in real life, the camera is of course just moving all over the place. And so to get your CGI to line up with this movement and not slide around within the shot, the visual effects teams need to replicate this camera movement on the computer as well. Otherwise, the CGI will never line up with the footage and it's going to be really obvious that it's fake. And so you achieve this replicated movement of the camera by tracking the movement of the footage. And if you get lucky, this can be a nice automated process where the computer just scans the footage and figures out all of this little movement detail for you. But on the complicated shots like those we see all throughout Transformers 2, where the camera is always sweeping around rapidly and shaking all over the place, this suddenly becomes very hard for the computer to automatically understand, as there's just too much going on for it. And so at the end of the day, the only way you could track a shot like this would be through just tedious manual effort. And so the people who do this are genuinely some of the unsung heroes of the visual effects industry, because without getting this absolutely perfect track of the footage, there's no way you could integrate all of this subtle detail around these robots. And so there'd just be no way we'd ever have gotten such a dynamic and realistic looking film as this if not for their insane efforts. And you know what? Speaking of unsung heroes, this brings me to another unsung hero of not just the entire visual effects industry, but also this film in particular, and that is the rotoscope artists. Because typically when you look at the behind the scenes of a film, whenever they're going to have an actor in the foreground and lots of CGI in the background, the filmmakers tend to put up a green or a blue screen, as this makes it much easier to insert the CGI behind them. But if you look at the behind the scenes of this film, there's basically never any blue screens, with there being maybe 2 throughout the entire film. And that's because, again, Michael Bay likes to shoot things for real, and so deliberately likes to work with the environment surrounding his actors to create this dynamic and cinematic framing, which is something that you just can't really do when all you're looking at is some green background. And so whilst this is great, it also means that without green screens, to insert any CGI behind these actors, each of them had to be constantly rotoscoped. which is a process where the actors have to be digitally drawn around by hand on a frame-by-frame basis as they move to separate them out from the rest of the image. And as you can imagine, this is just an absurdly time-consuming process, because any little movement like their fingers or even their hair twitching in the wind needs to be drawn around, and so it can take many artists an incredibly long time to do this for an entire movie. But it just paid off so much that they did do this, because even today there's not many other films out there that have this fantastic mix of actors, amazing CGI, and just fantastic cinematography with the environment around them. And so between these real world locations and the perfectly tracked interaction between the locations and the robots, you suddenly get a film that really feels ridiculously real, because at this point so much of it basically is. And so now, with all of this in mind, how did these smaller steps combine together to form this film's major visual achievements, such as the big lad himself, Devastator? Well, strangely enough, after everything we've discussed, in terms of actual unique differences or challenges, I don't actually have that much to discuss about Devastator, as firstly, the YouTuber Theorymus recently did a massive breakdown on him, and I don't want to retread on too much ground, but also, aside from all of those insane statistics that you hear about him, like he was 6 Optimus Primes worth of detail chucked together, or that he actually blew up someone's computer when he was loaded onto it, at his core, Devastator is just a much bigger manifestation of everything we've discussed in this video up until this point. You know, so his scene is in IMAX, so already he needs 8 times the detail of the rest of the film's characters, and then on top of that he's got these computer simulations that were massive and very difficult to control, and then on top of that he's perfectly interacting with the world around him, kicking up all of this sand and such, and then on top of that, all of this is being tied together by those unsung heroes we mentioned who are doing all of the meticulous frame-by-frame tasks like rotoscoping. But it's just that now, unlike the rest of the film, all of this is even harder because it's being done on a significantly bigger scale. And so to have any chance of doing this, all of those little tricks we mentioned throughout this video, like the artist having to work on one quadrant of the screen at a time, had to be massively dependent upon to make any of this possible. And so yeah, all of the praise this character gets is absolutely valid, and he genuinely does belong in like the visual effects Hall of Fame as one of the greatest CGI characters of all time. But now, with all of these pushed limits in mind, this now leads me to ask the big question that we've been building to, which is, did Michael Bay take all of this too far? As whilst the previous film was limited by its technology, and therefore everything in it was kind of brilliantly crafted around those limits, the freedom that was enabled by the technological advancements in this film meant Michael Bay was no longer held back, and he was essentially unleashed to do whatever he wanted. And so whilst Michael Bay clearly knows how to do action, clearly knows how to get locations you'd never think possible, and also has this fantastic relationship with things like the US military, which actually lets him make some pretty flipping good propaganda. You know, I wonder why this film ends with a big fight in the Middle East. And in fact, I'm not even joking, in the behind the scenes, they literally admit to this being propaganda.
Really, it's a perfect relationship. Michael Bay makes movies the way Michael Bay makes movies, which are big equipment, big action. The military is probably the best organization to provide that kind of support. And on the flip side, Transformers is targeted at a younger audience, which is right in line with who we like to talk to when it comes to recruiting.
But yeah, my point is that, despite all of his talents, it was also Michael Bay's idea to make these robots fart, or his idea to have Wheelie hump Megan Fox's leg, as in the original script he was going to be fun and sweet like his cartoon counterpart, but that then later on got changed by Bay to make him, and I quote, schizo. And then furthermore, it was also his idea to do the enemy scrotum thing, or to increase the violence significantly and essentially turn nice dad father figure Optimus Prime into a psychopath, to the point where it was Bay's only requirement for the forest fight that Optimus Prime should rip a guy's face in half. And then it was also Michael Bay's choice to make the characters drool and sort of bleed and just generally increase the violence level and push that PG-13 rating to its limit. And then finally it was also his choice to make the transformations faster and more kinetic, which, whilst looking really cool and probably making things a lot easier to animate, also meant that they kind of lost that beautiful majesty they had in the previous film where they transform so slowly and beautifully. And so while some of these choices may be subjectively quite good, a lot of the time I do find it quite hard to say whether they were definitively good choices or not. But then, in opposed to all of that, it is also quite interesting to consider just how highly people such as the visual effects team consistently spoke about not only how good Michael Bay's sort of management style is, but also his eye for CGI. As for example, whilst visual effects artists typically aim to make the most reality-based results possible, Michael Bay actually consistently pushed the team to break with this idea in a lot of places, and in the end actually turned out to be really right to do so, as the visual effects team wanted to keep things like scientifically correct motion blur on their robots, which, you know, is that thing where they use maths and science and stuff to figure out how blurry the robot should look on camera based on the speed they're moving around, which obviously makes sense to do because everything that moves on camera has to a degree some sense of blur to it, for example. But with the robots being so physically detailed, it meant that when blurred by motion, they would kind of just turn into visual mush on screen, even if this blur is what should be scientifically, mathematically correct. But with Michael Bay coming from this advertising background, he not only has a way of making things look impossibly real and almost ethereal, but he also believes that the audience should be able to see what they've paid for, and therefore he deliberately pushed for these robots to always be very sharp on screen, oftentimes sharper than the actual footage itself, even though this went completely against the rules of making good-looking CGI. But for some reason, this really worked for this film, because there's something just so magically captivating about this visuals, as the whole thing really does have this clean, perfect, advert-like aesthetic that, again, you just don't get anywhere else. And so yeah, to summarize all of this, regardless of things like the writer's strike and its effect on this movie's narrative, I think this film was a real sign of things to come with this franchise. That each of these movies are going to be these incredible technical demonstrations that massively push the limits of filmmaking, but that at the same time, you are also going to have to deal with this strange Michael Bay energy at each step of the journey, with very varying results as to whether this energy is a good idea or not. However, we should also consider that if you look at the stuff that Bay is no longer involved in, like that big battle at the end of Rise of the Beasts, where you essentially just have loads of CGI hitting each other in some big CGI open field, versus the ridiculous efforts here and just how good they look, I think it's really hard to say that Michael Bay wasn't at least getting some things right. But I guess we'll get to those films when we get there. Thank you for watching, everyone, and if you like this video, I guarantee you'll also enjoy our film podcast. So far, we've covered a bunch of different Transformers films, and each week it just gets better and better. And the one we did on Revenge of the Fallen is absolutely my favourite one so far. So please click the link below if you want to hear some upbeat film discussions. And speaking of Transformers coverage, if you also click the other link below, I also guarantee you'll enjoy our Patreon, where for less than $2 a month, you can get access to a bunch of exclusive videos and much, much more. Every little bit of support means the absolute world and goes straight back into the videos. So thank you to my Patreon subs. So that is Darth Gader, Modern Adventurer, Cthulhu88, Chris Colleen, Archer Green, Janal Van Menzel, and then an even bigger thank you to Lime, Rye Jones, and Nathan Kelshat, and then just an absolutely massive thank you to Darren Birmingham.